On the freezing night of December 29th, 1610, George Thurzo, the powerful Palatine of Hungary, marched an armed retinue of soldiers up the steep, icy incline toward the towering stone gates of Choctachi Castle. He had been sent by King Matthias II himself to investigate a series of dark, terrifying rumors that had been bleeding out of the countryside for years. Whispers of peasant girls vanishing into the fortress, never to be seen again. What Thurzo and his men discovered when they breached the castle walls would forever cement the master of the estate as the most prolific female serial killer in recorded human history. According to Thurzo's own heavily documented letters to his wife, the search party was immediately hit with the overwhelming stench of decay, discovering one young woman already dead in the main hall, another brutally tortured and barely clinging to life, and several others locked in a dungeon, awaiting an agonizing fate. The architect of this subterranean slaughterhouse was not a rogue outlaw or a deranged peasant, but Countess Elizabeth Báthory, an incredibly powerful, hyper-educated noblewoman who used her unimaginable wealth and untouchable political status to inflict decades of unchecked, sadistic horror upon the young women of her domain. To understand how a monster of this magnitude could operate in plain sight, you have to understand the absolute, unyielding power of the Báthory bloodline. Born in 1560 into one of the most illustrious and fiercely influential Protestant families in Transylvania, Elizabeth was raised in an era of constant warfare and extreme brutality, highly educated in multiple languages, but entirely accustomed to the absolute subjugation of the peasant class. At the age of 15, she was married to Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a brutal and celebrated military commander known as the Black Knight of Hungary for his vicious campaigns against the Ottoman Empire. Because her husband was constantly away at war, Elizabeth was left in absolute autonomous control of his massive estates, including the sprawling, isolated Choctachi Castle, situated in the Carpathian Mountains of present-day Slovakia. In the late 16th century, a noblewoman's authority over her serfs was total and unquestioned. She was the law, the judge, and the executioner within her lands. Initially, the victims were strictly peasant girls, daughters of local farmers lured to the castle with the promise of well-paying work as maidservants, only to find themselves trapped in an isolated fortress where the Countess's sadistic impulses were allowed to fester, escalate, and completely detach from reality. While pop culture has heavily sensationalized her crimes with myths of her bathing in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth, a fabrication that actually didn't appear in written records until over a century after her death, the documented reality found in the sworn testimonies of her trials is infinitely more cruel and deeply disturbing. When her husband died in 2004, any remaining restraint evaporated, and the Countess, aided by a dedicated inner circle of loyal, terrifying accomplices like her former nurse Ilona Yo and a brutal local woman known as Dorko, turned the castle into a systematic torture chamber. According to the horrifying depositions of over 300 witnesses, the tortures were drawn out and agonizing. Servants were brutally beaten for minor infractions, subjected to freezing water and left in the snow to die of exposure, starved in the dungeons, and violently mutilated with needles routinely driven under their fingernails. For years, the local authorities turned a blind eye, writing off the staggering death toll as diseases ravaging the peasant staff. But Elizabeth Báthory made a fatal, arrogant miscalculation in 1609. Having depleted the local supply of peasant girls, she began inviting the daughters of the lesser nobility to Choctachi under the guise of teaching them courtly etiquette. When young aristocrats suddenly began dying of mysterious illnesses, their influential families demanded answers, and the impenetrable shield of the Báthory name finally began to crack.
The whispers reached a deafening roar when a prominent Lutheran minister, Istvan Magyari, publicly accused the Countess of mass murder from his pulpit in Vienna, forcing King Matthias II to act. The king, heavily indebted to the Báthory family to fund his wars, ordered George Thurzo to launch a formal inquiry, leading to the covert collection of witness statements from clergymen, grieving parents, and terrified castle staff, culminating in that fateful, chilling raid on December 29, 1610. The aftermath of the raid was swift and merciless for those who carried out the Countess's dark orders. In January of 1911, an expedited trial was held for her accomplices. Ilona Yo and Dorko had their fingers ripped off with hot pincers before being burned alive at the stake, while the male accomplices were swiftly beheaded. During these trials, a physical ledger belonging to Elizabeth was allegedly referenced, said to contain the names of over 650 victims in her own handwriting, a number that has sparked intense historical debate, but undeniably cements the vast industrial scale of her cruelty. Yet despite overwhelming evidence and the execution of her entire inner circle, Countess Elizabeth Báthory herself never faced a judge, never stood trial, and never was officially convicted. Because executing a woman of her supreme aristocratic standing would have caused a massive political scandal and allowed the king to seize the vast Báthory lands, her family negotiated a chilling, permanent solution. The Blood Countess was condemned to solitary confinement within the very walls where she committed her atrocities. She was bricked into a set of windowless rooms in Choctachi Castle, with only small slits left open for air and the passing of meager rations. She remained entirely isolated in the dark, trapped with the ghosts of the hundreds she had slaughtered, until she was found dead on the morning of August 21st, 1614. The legend of the vampiric Blood Countess has haunted European folklore for centuries, obscuring the infinitely darker truth that the real monster wasn't a supernatural creature bathing in blood, but a human being granted absolute power, unchecked wealth, and a terrifying belief that the lives of those beneath her simply did not matter.